Antoine Pettis walked into court all smiles, showing off for reporters there to see the man charged with a crime that made even veteran police cringe.
Foy was smiling and laughing while Forney's sister read a victim impact statement. The judge criticized Foy for his body language and sent him out of the courtroom after claiming he was wrongfully convicted.
20-year-old Jahmere Manning pleading guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder. He admitted to firing more than 30 gunshots in the direction of a group of people. One person hit by the bullets was Forney. She was killed just weeks before her high school graduation.
You should think all the days that you're in there, you should think about the things that you did and the pain that you caused us.
Every night when we go to sleep and we think about my niece, I hope he carry that same pain. Every single day of his 20 years to life, he should think about my niece.
At 2:00 a.m. on September 1st, 2013, the quiet stillness of Milwaukee's north side was shattered. A 101-year-old woman, frail, gentle, and living alone in the same house she had called home for 6 decades, woke to a sound that no one her age should ever have to hear. Within seconds, the intruder entered a 20-year-old man named Antoine Pettis. He had slipped through a window and entered into her bedroom. He didn't come for her jewelry. He didn't come for money. He came for something far more sinister. He struck her, slapping her across the face with such force that her frail body shook. He pinned her to the bed and assaulted her, stealing her dignity in the most horrifying way possible. And when he left, he didn't just take her peace, he took her independence. Imagine doing that to a 101-year-old woman. When Pettis fled the scene, the elderly woman, shaken, bleeding, and terrified, summoned all the strength she had left. She managed to reach a neighbor and call police. Officers and paramedics arrived to find her injured and in shock. According to the criminal complaint and multiple news outlets including Reuters and Fox 6 Milwaukee, she told investigators that she had been slapped repeatedly, held down and sexually assaulted by a young man who broke into her home through a window around 2:00 a.m. She was taken to the hospital for treatment, where a rape kit was collected. Medical staff found bruises, lacerations, and DNA evidence that would become the key to solving the case. The attack forced her to leave the home she had lived in for more than 60 years. Family members later confirmed that the trauma left her so fearful that she moved into assisted living, never to return to the house she once called safe. Months later, the world saw him for the first time. As Antoine Pettis was escorted into court, the room filled with reporters, officers, and stunned silence. But Pettis didn't hang his head. He looked straight into the cameras, smirked, and said the words that chilled an entire city. "Y'all gonna make me a celebrity." He grinned as if the brutality of his crime was a performance, and this courtroom, his stage. Why did he smile? What was he trying to prove? And who truly paid the price that night? The victim, the community, or the conscience of a man who mistook notoriety for power? Stay with us as we uncover the events that led to that haunting smile and the lifelong sentence that followed. Before we delve into this, we want to appreciate you for joining us today and welcome you to the final hour. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and before we go deeper into this chilling case, I want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Drop your city and your time in the comments. Let's uncover the truth behind the smile. Antoine Devin Pettis was born circa 1993, so by 2013 he was 20. He grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city with neighborhoods facing economic pressure, high crime rates, and systemic social challenges. One notable concern, Pettis already had pending legal trouble before the 2013 assault. He had been charged in 2013 with obstructing an officer and possessing THC. Importantly, he had a bench warrant for failing to appear at a hearing in that case, August 2013. This suggests he had already slipped into a pattern of disrespecting court orders and perhaps living with legal instability. When the DNA evidence in the elderly woman's assault case was analyzed, investigators used familial DNA, matching to a relative's profile, to identify him. He already had DNA on record due to a paternity case. This prior involvement in legal and biological record systems hints at a history of instability or complications before the assault. Pettis's later statements indicate impulsivity. He told police he had entered the home intending burglary, but when he found nothing he wanted, he escalated to sexual assault. He also claimed chillingly that if he had planned the assault, he would have used a condom, implying that the sexual violence was an afterthought. His behavior in court, smiling, seeking media attention, saying, "You all gonna make me a celebrity," suggests a disposition toward grandstanding and emotional detachment from the suffering of others. We don't know what drove him in his youth. We know what he did when the moment came. What happens when a seemingly nondescript life crosses the threshold into violence? The date was September 1st, 2013. Around 2:00 a.m., most of Milwaukee lay asleep under the stillness of a late summer night. For the 101-year-old woman, those were hours of vulnerability, perhaps restless, perhaps asleep, but certainly alone in her home, accustomed to years of routines and peace. Meanwhile, for Antoine Pettis, age 20, this was the moment he chose to act. According to his own later statements, he and an accomplice entered the woman's home intending a burglary. What we don't fully know is what was going on in Pettis's mind just prior. Was he desperate? Was he under pressure? Financial? Social? Emotional? We lack reliable public records of his immediate motive. What is clear is that Pettis believed the home held something he might steal. That belief was his entry point. Once inside, Pettis found nothing of value, or at least nothing he deemed worth taking. Faced with an empty hall, the original motive of burglary collapsed. At that pivot, Pettis's behavior shifted. In his confession, he admitted that the sexual assault occurred only after discovering there was nothing he wanted to steal. He reportedly said, "He did not plan the sexual assault, or he would have worn a condom." That chilling line suggests the violence was not part of an organized plan, but rather an impulsive escalation. This moment is a key hinge. The crime went from property crime to horrific assault in an instant. Once Pettis confronted the woman in her bedroom, the violence was swift and brutal. He allegedly told her to shut up. He slapped her repeatedly in the face, delivering force to the most vulnerable part of her body. He grabbed her wrists or limbs to restrain her and forced her into a sexual assault on her own bed. Given her advanced age, every gesture, slap, hold, struggle would have been far more damaging, far more traumatic than to a younger body. The context magnifies the cruelty. When the assault ended, Pettis fled. He left behind DNA evidence on the victim, her nightgown, possibly bedding or surfaces evidence that would later serve as forensic breadcrumbs. After Pettis departed, the victim evacuated from her home, seeking help. Reports say she made her way to neighbors and authorities, bleeding and shaken. Paramedics and police arrived, treated her injuries, and performed a forensic rape examination, a rape kit, to collect physical and DNA evidence. Because of her age, even small injuries, bruises, cuts, abrasions would carry magnified danger. The assault forced her to leave her home of 60-plus years. She never returned, instead moving into assisted living due to fear and trauma. While many survivors never speak publicly of final words or cries, the silence in her home after Pettis left would have echoed with more damage than the assault itself. From the public record, there is no documented pattern of prior sexual violence by Pettis. Most stories emphasize that this was not a previously known predator case. However, there were behavioral red flags. He had existing legal involvement. He failed to appear in a prior case involving obstruction of an officer and THC possession. His DNA was already in state records via a paternity case, which suggests he had exposure to civil or legal systems before this crime. His courtroom behavior, smiling, seeking media attention, shows a lack of remorse or inhibition that may have been present before the event. Thus, while the crime itself was shocking in its severity and target, some of Pettis's attitudes and legal history hinted at risk factors. After the assault, the 101-year-old victim was transported to a hospital where she received medical treatment and forensic examination. The crime scene investigators collected DNA evidence, bodily fluids, and fibers from her nightgown, bedding, and the immediate area. Investigators also processed the crime scene in the victim's home, dusting for fingerprints, photographing positions of objects and evidence, and collecting anything that might bear the assailant's trace evidence, implied in criminal investigative procedure, supported by reporting on how DNA was used. When standard DNA matching yielded no direct hit, the investigators moved to a more advanced method, familial DNA searching. This approach compares crime scene DNA profiles to DNA in criminal or civil databases to find possible relatives whose profiles can lead to a suspect. In this case, DNA recovered from the nightgown matched traits closely aligned with a male relative whose DNA was already in state records. Because Pettis had DNA on file from a prior son paternity case, authorities were able to compare and confirm a match. This identification method was notable because Pettis's case became one of the very few in Wisconsin history in which familial DNA was used to link a suspect to a crime. On or around the November 18, 2014. Pettis was formally charged in Milwaukee County Circuit Court with burglary, aggravated battery to an elderly person, and second-degree sexual assault. When he was brought into court, Pettis made headlines by smiling broadly, looking toward cameras and saying, "Y'all gonna make me a celebrity." Pettis initially entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. However, defense plans for that plea were later abandoned. A doctor's evaluation, psychiatric report, was obtained to assess whether he met the standard for insanity or mental unfitness, but media coverage indicates the evaluation did not support his plea. Ultimately, Pettis changed his plea to war guilty before going to full trial. Because Pettis entered a guilty plea, the case did not proceed to a full jury trial with cross-examination of witnesses or presentation of competing narratives. That means the public record focuses more on the plea hearing, sentencing hearing, and written motions rather than trial transcripts. The prosecution emphasized aggravating factors. 1. The extreme age of the victim, 101, and her vulnerability. 2. The brutality and force of the assault, as recounted in the criminal complaint, slaps to the face aggression compelling her in her bed. 3. The breach of sanctity, a home invasion in which the victim should have felt safe. 4. The strength of the DNA evidence linking Pettis directly to the crime scene. The prosecution likely argued that such violence demanded a consecutive sentencing scheme and use of maximum permissible penalties, supported by the sentencing outcome, which assigned separate consecutive terms. Pettis's initial strategy, pleading not guilty by reason of mental defect, suggests the defense intended to argue insanity or diminished capacity. That plea was later withdrawn. After psychiatric evaluation failed to substantiate the defense's mental illness claim, Pettis changed his plea to guilty. The defense may also have sought mitigation, his youth, lack of prior major convictions, or any personal hardship. But public reporting focuses more on the gravity of the crime and less on mitigation. On January 22, 2015, Judge Jeffrey Wagner, or another Milwaukee County judge in sentencing, handed down a sentence of 30 years in prison, plus 15 years of extended supervision. The sentence was broken down into consecutive terms: 7 years for burglary, 3 years for aggravated battery, 20 years for second-degree sexual assault. Those were stacked to total 30 years, with the extended supervision period added afterward. This meant Pettis would serve the sentences back-to-back, not concurrently, amplifying the punitive impact. And the young man who entered the courtroom earlier with a confident smile, exuding an aura of bravado as he playfully imagining that the notoriety of his crime would catapult him to celebrity status. However, when the judge announced the verdict, a wave of disbelief washed over him, shattering his facade. The reality of his situation sank in, leaving him devastated and speechless as the implications of his actions became painfully clear, and the judge made clear the attack was among the most heinous the court had seen, especially given the victim's age and the violence used. The victim did not attend on the sentencing hearing in person. Instead, she submitted a videotaped statement, which the judge watched. The recorded statement allowed her to express the trauma, fear, and loss she suffered. The public record notes that the court respected her desire to avoid further public exposure. The judge, in sentencing, repeatedly referenced the emotional devastation and violation of her sanctity, underscoring how deeply the crime wounded more than her body. When the verdict came down, justice was served. But healing was another matter. For a 101-year-old survivor, justice came too late to return her peace. She never went back to the home where she was attacked. The house that once held memories of children, birthdays, and quiet mornings became a place she could no longer enter. Her family later confirmed she moved permanently into an assisted living facility, her independence taken by fear, not by age. In Milwaukee, the case sent ripples through every neighborhood. People looked at their grandparents and great-grandparents differently that week, with fear, with anger, and with a desperate question. If a woman who lived a century could still be attacked in her bed, who among us is truly safe? Community leaders demanded stronger protection for the elderly. Churches held vigils. Neighbors began organizing volunteer patrols for seniors living alone. The assault wasn't just an isolated crime. It became a symbol of broken security in a city that prided itself on resilience. When Antoine Pettis first appeared in court, the world saw his smirk. The line, "Y'all gonna make me a celebrity," became a headline that dominated local and national outlets. It shocked the conscience of the country. Social media erupted. Some called him heartless, others soulless. Even experienced reporters struggled to describe the dissonance. A young man treating infamy as fame, standing accused of a crime that defied human decency. For weeks, news broadcasts replayed that moment, his grin against the flash of cameras, contrasting it with the frail silhouette of a centenarian victim, unseen but unforgettable. But as sentencing approached, that smirk disappeared. Reality set in. No cameras could turn him into the celebrity he imagined. Only the cold certainty of a prison cell could answer his arrogance. Within Milwaukee's justice system, the case marked a turning point. It was one of the first in Wisconsin to successfully use familial DNA technology, linking Pettis to the crime through a relative's profile in a state database. This innovation would go on to aid future cases, giving hope to victims of unsolved crimes. Police officers involved in the investigation later described it as one of the most disturbing of their careers. The shock of the crime pushed lawmakers and local agencies to discuss improved home safety programs, senior emergency response systems, and increased penalties for crimes against elderly citizens. For the victim's family, the wounds were deeper than physical. Her relatives said she stopped sleeping through the night. She feared being alone, even in daylight. What Pettis stole that night wasn't gold or jewelry. It was her sense of safety after a lifetime of surviving every hardship the world had already thrown at her. She had lived through wars, economic depressions, and decades of change, only to face her greatest horror in the century's quietest hours. Her story became a rallying cry for compassion, awareness, and community vigilance. People who never met her began checking in on their elderly neighbors. Milwaukee remembered her not as a victim, but as a survivor, a symbol of endurance and dignity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Today, Antoine Devin Pettis sits behind bars at Green Bay Correctional Institution, where in Wisconsin, a maximum security facility. He will not be eligible for parole until around when he will be in his early 50s. His name, once associated with arrogance and bravado, now sits quietly in the state's offender registry, surrounded by silence instead of cameras. There are no new interviews, no media appearances, just time, concrete, and consequence. Prison records indicate no major public developments in his case since sentencing. He remains incarcerated, serving the post 30-year sentence handed down in 2015, followed by 15 years of supervision. If released, he will be under lifetime sex offender registration, his movements, associations, and choices monitored indefinitely. This case left Milwaukee with a scar, but also a reminder: evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it enters through a window, quiet and deliberate. Yet even in the darkest acts, there's a lesson. It taught a city about vigilance. It reminded the justice system of the power of science. And it reminded us all that humanity's greatest strength is not power or fear, but empathy. If you're watching this right now, I'd like to ask, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Because for one woman, time stopped at 2 a.m. that night. For the rest of us, the question lingers. Will we remember her story, or wait until it happened? Case 2. It was the afternoon of May 3, 2021, and the spring sun had settled softly over Essex Street in Albany, New York. The hum of city life rolled through the neighborhood, kids laughing after school, cars idling at intersections, friends talking on porches. For a moment it was a peaceful weekday, the kind that slips by unnoticed. But at 3:45 p.m., the stillness shattered. A rapid, deafening burst of gunfire tore through the air, 31 rounds in total echoing off brick walls and apartment buildings. The shots came so fast that witnesses described them as one continuous explosion. 3. People screamed, cars swerved, windows cracked under the impact of stray bullets. And in the chaos, 18-year-old Chyna Forney, a high school senior with dreams of walking the graduation stage, was struck in the back by a single bullet, a random, fatal intrusion into a life that had done nothing to invite it. The bullet wasn't meant for her. Prosecutors would later reveal that the intended target was someone else in the crowd, a young man who was shot in the shoulder, but survived. Chyna, innocent and unaware, had simply been standing nearby, caught between two men who decided pride and anger mattered more than human life. As the gunfire died, the air filled with a suffocating silence. Witnesses described seeing Chyna collapse into the arms of friends, her white sneakers stained red as they screamed for help. "Stay with me," one cried, clutching her as neighbors emerged from their homes in disbelief. Within minutes, police sirens wailed down the narrow Albany street. Officers rushed to the scene, weaving between parked cars riddled with bullet holes. Shell casings glittered across the asphalt like tiny fragments of violence frozen in the daylight. Paramedics arrived, lifting Chyna gently onto a stretcher. She was still breathing barely. Blood pooled beneath her shirt where the bullet had entered her back. Despite desperate efforts to save her, Chyna was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at Albany Medical Center. The realization struck the city like a shockwave. A teenager just weeks away from her high school graduation had been gunned down on her own street in broad daylight. Her death wasn't just tragic, it was incomprehensible. She had no part in the dispute that sparked it, no connection to the violence that took her life. Chyna was known for her warmth and determination. She attended Albany Leadership Charter High School for Girls, where teachers described her as a light, always smiling, always encouraging others. Her classmates were preparing for prom, for graduation pictures, for the next chapter of life. Now they were planning a candlelight vigil. The sheer volume of gunfire, 31 bullets, painted a horrifying picture of rage and recklessness. This wasn't a random shooting by an unknown gunman in the dark of night. It was a broad daylight ambush, fueled by a dispute that spiraled into deadly violence. According to police, two young men, Alvin III and Jahmere Manning, drove to Essex Street that afternoon armed and ready. Witnesses reported seeing them approach a crowd, weapons drawn, before opening fire without warning. The streets became a battlefield. The intended victim was hit, but survived. Chyna did not. Investigators later said the men had been seeking retribution over a petty dispute. What began as a confrontation between young men turned into a scene of mass terror, one that would haunt the community long after the sound of gunfire faded. Neighbors described ducking behind cars and inside homes. One mother, whose young child had been playing outside, said she threw herself over her son as bullets tore past her front steps. "It sounded like a war zone," she recalled. "I thought we were all going to die." The intended victim was hit but survived. Chyna did not. Investigators later said the men had been seeking retribution over a petty dispute. What began as a confrontation between young men turned into a scene of mass terror, one that would haunt the community long after the sound of gunfire faded. Neighbors described ducking behind cars and inside homes. One mother, whose young child had been playing outside, said she threw herself over her son as bullets tore past her front steps. "It sounded like a war zone," she recalled. "I thought we were all going to die." Within hours, police cordoned off the area. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze as detectives began counting casings and marking evidence. The weight of loss settled heavy over the neighborhood. Flowers and candles soon appeared where Chyna had fallen. Her friends wrote messages in chalk on the pavement. "Rest in power, Chyna. We love you forever." That day, Albany didn't just lose a teenager. It lost a symbol of promise, a reminder of what violence steals not just from victims, but from entire communities. The shooting wasn't an accident of fate. It was the direct result of a choice, a decision by two young men to answer conflict with bullets. And as her family grieved, the city demanded answers. Why her? Why now? And how had it come to this? But behind every tragedy lies a trail of choices. Who were these men before the violence? What turned them into killers? And how did the law rise to speak for a young woman who could no longer speak for herself? Investigators in the New York State Attorney General's office revealed that Alvin Foy III and Jahmere Manning were connected to a dangerous street organization known locally as the 50 Gang. Authorities described the group as one of Albany's most active criminal networks, deeply involved in gun trafficking, drug distribution, and street retaliation shootings across the capital region. Foy was even described by law enforcement sources as a leading figure within the network, a young man who commanded influence despite his age. In 2021, a sweeping Albany County indictment charged nearly 50 suspected gang members with crimes ranging from illegal firearm possession to drug trafficking and conspiracy. Prosecutors linked several shootings, drive-bys, and retaliatory attacks directly to these same networks, the same ecosystem where Foy and Manning grew up. For many teens in these neighborhoods, guns were not distant symbols of crime. They were part of everyday survival. This environment of poverty, fear, and constant violence helped shape a mindset where carrying weapons, settling scores, and standing one's ground were seen as necessities. Exposure to illicit economies from an early age, drug sales, quick cash, and street loyalty may have taught Foy and Manning that power and respect were earned through intimidation rather than achievement. 2 months before the murder of Chyna Forney, both Foy and Manning were charged in a separate Albany shooting. On March 12, 2021, the pair allegedly opened fire into a parked car, injuring a 27-year-old man. The earlier shooting served as a clear red flag, revealing their escalating familiarity with firearms and a pattern of violent impulsivity that would later explode on Essex Street. In a heartbreaking revelation, Chyna Forney's sister told the court that Foy had shared meals and moments with their family, saying they had broke bread before. The betrayal deepened the grief. This wasn't a faceless shooter attacking a stranger. It was someone who had once been part of their social circle. The Forney family said they had expected better from him, a line that underscores the depth of the tragedy. During sentencing, Alvin Foy displayed what reporters called disturbing arrogance. He laughed as Chyna's sister delivered her victim impact statement, interrupted Judge Roger McDonough, and refused to stay silent even as he was admonished. His lack of remorse forced the court to remove him from the room, and he was sentenced in absentia, a rare and telling decision. Unlike Foy, Jahmere Manning eventually pleaded guilty. In his confession, he admitted that both he and Foy fired 31 bullets together during the Essex Street attack. His admission confirmed what prosecutors alleged from the beginning, that the killing of Chyna Forney was not an accident, but the consequence of two men acting in concert, each amplifying the other's violence. Albany's police chief at the time remarked that gun crimes by individuals under 25 had reached alarming levels. The death of Chyna Forney became a turning point, symbolizing a generation's war with itself. communities that once dismissed street altercations as just kids fighting could no longer ignore the mounting body count. Foy and Manning's stories also expose a larger societal failure. Both young men were old enough to understand right from wrong, yet likely never had consistent mentors, intervention programs, or access to trauma counseling that might have rerouted their paths. Without structure, violence became their default language. Within months, the names Alvin Foy and Jahmere Manning were synonymous with Albany's gun epidemic. What began as a petty street feud ended in the execution-style murder of an innocent girl, sparking citywide outrage. Their transformation from ordinary neighborhood faces to convicted killers became a cautionary tale about how quickly youth violence can turn deadly. The afternoon of May 3, 2021 in Albany had the ordinary cadence of spring. Essex Street bustled, people returning from appointments, kids walking home from school, cars turning corners. There was nothing in the air to warn that this would be a day marked in tragedy. But tensions had already been simmering. In local community chatter and police reports, retaliation, street disputes, and weapon possession had been increasing across Albany neighborhoods. The city was grappling with a spike in gun violence, especially among young men. Foy and Manning, both young men steeped in that environment, were not strangers to conflict. They had earlier been implicated in a March 12, 2021 shooting, reportedly firing into a car and injuring a man. That incident signaled a willingness to use firearms in public disputes. It is part of the background that indicates escalation. On that afternoon, sources say that Foy and Manning drove toward Essex Street, possibly intending to confront someone over a dispute. Reports describe them arriving with firearms and moving into a crowd. What exactly was said or what sparked the final trigger is not fully known in public records, but in the swirl of arguments, posturing, unresolved tension, one or both of them drew their guns. The crowd around them, unaware of the moment's danger, became an unwilling audience. Foy and Manning fired 31 shots into the gathering, an overwhelming volume of fire that suggests not a single targeted strike but a broad barrage. The sheer number of rounds indicates intent to dominate, suppress, or terrorize, not precision. Among the victims was the intended target, who survived with a shoulder wound. But bullets do not always discriminate. In the chaos, Chyna Forney, standing nearby, was struck in the back by a stray bullet. She had nothing to do with the dispute, no means of escape. Her life was taken by circumstance and by the dangerous choices of others. Witnesses recounted seeing bodies drop, screams erupt, shouts for cover, and people scattering. Windows shattered. Cars bore fresh bullet holes. The sudden eruption of violence turned a quiet street into a war zone. In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. Some perpetrators ran, others ducked. Evidence, shell casings, spent bullets, lay scattered across Essex Street. Police arrived quickly, securing the scene and beginning to collect forensic clues. As paramedics worked, Chyna was transported to the hospital. She was still alive, but grievously injured. Her friends and bystanders held on to hope until it slipped. She was declared dead shortly thereafter. Her dreams and future gone in a moment she never saw coming. The physical details, 31 shots, multiple victims, stray bullets, public setting, reveal a crime that was not a spur-of-the-moment act in an empty lot, but a bold, lethal outburst in broad daylight. It reveals a dangerous confidence in anonymity and force. That day also showed patterns consistent with gang-related or retaliatory shootings. Arrival by car, weapons drawn in public, gunfire toward multiple people, risk of collateral damage. The violence was too loud, too many rounds, too few constraints. The day also exposed emotional and situational triggers, disputes unresolved, pride challenged, perhaps fear or reputation at stake. In an environment where resolve is tested by intimidation, it only takes a spark for things to howl. After the shots, Foy's behavior in court later, laughing during victim statements, interrupting the judge, shows that in his mind, the gravity of his actions may not have registered fully. The same detachment or defiance perhaps existed that day on Essex Street. A single day, a single decision to fire, transformed lives. For Chyna, it ended everything. For a city, it demanded answers. For two young men, it sealed a path none would escape. The murder of new 18-year-old Chyna Forney unfolded in broad daylight on May 3, 2021, along Essex Street, leaving little doubt about what had happened. When Albany police officers arrived, they found shell casings scattered like confetti across the pavement. 31 in total. A devastating sign of a close-range assault. Witnesses were still screaming, pointing in all directions. A young woman lay on the asphalt, motionless. Paramedics tried desperately to stabilize her, but within minutes, Chyna was pronounced dead at Albany Medical Center. The scene was chaotic but telling. Multiple bullet trajectories, several vehicles hit, and at least 2 victims. Detectives quickly concluded this was not random. It was targeted gunfire, likely part of an ongoing dispute. Albany's Major Crimes Unit and the District Attorney's Office immediately treated the case as a priority homicide. Within 24 hours, detectives had begun reviewing Boisson surveillance footage from nearby buildings and street cameras. Dozens of witness statements were taken, and ballistic experts began mapping the trajectory of bullets to determine firing positions. It wasn't long before evidence pointed to 2 names already known to law enforcement: Alvin Foy III and Jahmere Manning. Both young men had recently been under investigation for another shooting just on 7 weeks earlier, on March 12, 2021, where they allegedly fired into a car and injured a 27-year-old man. The same type of weapon, a 9mm handgun, was believed to have been used in both cases. Forensic teams recovered casings that matched the earlier incident, creating a ballistic fingerprint linking Foy and Manning directly to Chyna's killing. Investigators built their case piece by piece. Surveillance footage placed both Foy and Manning near the crime scene minutes before the shooting. Ballistics tests confirmed that the guns used matched those linked to prior violent offenses. Eyewitnesses described 2 men firing into a crowd before fleeing in a vehicle registered to an associate of Foy. This combination of physical evidence and witness cooperation created a solid chain of proof, one that left little room for doubt. On May 13, 2021, just 10 days after Chyna's murder, Albany police announced the arrest of Alvin Foy III. His co-defendant, Jahmere Manning, was taken into custody shortly afterward. Both were charged with second-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. From the start, Foy showed no visible remorse. According to court observers, his demeanor during questioning and pretrial hearings ranged from detached to openly defiant. He denied firing the fatal shot and maintained that he was not present at the scene, even though physical evidence and surveillance footage said otherwise. During hearings, Foy often appeared restless and dismissive, smirking at prosecutors and occasionally whispering jokes to others in custody. This behavior would later carry into the courtroom, becoming one of the most controversial aspects of the trial. Manning, on the other hand, ultimately confessed. Facing overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and accepted a sentence of 20 years to life, confirming that both he and Foy had fired into the crowd that killed Chyna Forney. Foy's case proceeded to a full jury trial in Albany County Court. In late 2022, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: video footage, eyewitness accounts, ballistic matches, and expert testimony linking Foy directly to the murder weapon. They argued that Foy acted with depraved indifference to human life, firing 31 bullets into a crowded street with reckless disregard for anyone in the line of fire. The prosecution emphasized the ripple effect of senseless gun violence, showing pictures of Chyna in her graduation gown, a life full of promise, stolen in seconds. The second defense, led by public counsel, maintained Foy's innocence. They argued that our witnesses were unreliable, that our ballistic evidence was circumstantial, and that the real shooter could have been someone else. Foy himself continued to insist he was wrongly accused, claiming multiple witnesses could prove he wasn't there. But jurors were unconvinced. After days of deliberation, they found Foy guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 weapons charges. The trial was emotionally charged, but the sentencing hearing would make headlines across New York State. During a Chyna Forney's family impact statements, her sister stood before Foy and spoke directly to him, her voice trembling. "You were out with us multiple times. You knew her. You knew us. She was 3 weeks from graduation, and you took that away." As she spoke, Foy laughed. He leaned back in his chair, grinning, even chuckling while the family wept. Judge Roger McDonough stopped the proceedings, warning Foy to remain silent. But the defendant continued smirking and interrupting the court. The judge's patience snapped. "Anyone with a shred of human decency would not sit here and laugh," McDonough thundered. When Foy refused to stop, the judge ordered deputies to remove him from the courtroom and sentenced him in absentia, meaning without his presence. On this June 27, 2023, Alvin Foy III was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison, the maximum penalty allowed under New York law for his charges. His co-defendant, Jahmere Manning, was already serving 20 years to life, following his guilty plea. The courtroom erupted in tears and anger. Chyna's mother sobbed quietly in the front row, clutching a framed photo of her daughter. Friends and classmates filled the benches, wearing shirts printed with her name. The judge's gavel fell heavy, marking the end of one of Albany's most emotional trials in years. Foy showed no visible remorse, no apology, no acknowledgement of guilt. His smirk, frozen in courtroom footage, became the image most residents remembered, a chilling contrast to the radiant senior photo of Chyna Forney that circulated in memorials. The Albany County District Attorney's Office called the conviction a victory for accountability in a city struggling with rising youth gun violence. Officials highlighted that the case demonstrated how partnership between forensic science, witness testimony, and community cooperation could bring justice even amid fear. The Forney family expressed relief but not closure. Justice was served, Chyna's sister said, but it will never bring her back. Foy is currently incarcerated in a New York State correctional facility, eligible for parole in 2046. Manning will not see a parole board before 2044. The trial of Alvin Foy III left the community with haunting questions. How did 2 young men, barely out of their teens, end up firing 31 bullets into a crowd over a dispute no one even remembers? What turns youth anger into homicide? Albany officials have since pushed for expanded intervention programs, youth mentoring initiatives, and conflict resolution training in schools to prevent the next tragedy. But for Chyna Forney's family, the loss remains immeasurable. A promise unfulfilled, a graduation never walked. These stories remind us that behind every headline is a life that once had dreams, a family that still carries the pain, and a community forever changed. Justice may have spoken in these cases, but the echoes of what happened still linger. If you've watched this far, thank you for being part of this community that believes every story deserves to be told with truth and dignity. Your support helps keep these stories alive and helps us continue shining light on cases that should never be forgotten. So before you go, take a moment to do 3 simple things. Subscribe to the channel, share this video so more people can hear these voices, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and which case you'd like us to cover next, because every view, every comment, every share helps us uncover another story that deserves justice. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you again in the next episode, right here, on The Final Hour.